It's the Real News Network. I'm Charmony Pires coming to you from Baltimore. On Sunday, French voters will be choosing between the neoliberal centrist Emmanuel Macron and a far-right candidate Marine Le Pen. The Telegraph poll tracker currently shows Macron with a 21-point lead, although polls have been wrong before. The runoff has proven to be among the most divisive elections in recent memory. Even former U.S. President Barack Obama has weighed in, urging French voters to support Macron, a man he said he admires. Our next guest released his own video also urging voters to consider voting for Macron, but not as a candidate that he admires, but rather as lesser of two evils. The French human rights advocate describes what he calls the two evils on offer for French public and what he believes needs to be done for a better future. Well, joining us today is Yasser Louati. Yasser is French human rights and civil liberties advocate. His most recent article in Medium is titled Marine Le Pen or Emmanuel Macron, Hitler or Uber. Thanks for joining us, Yasser.
Thank you for having me.
So, Yasser, let's start off with this provocative title you've given your article and the video you produced. Hitler or Uber, can you explain that?
It's as the rise of fascism in France was actually a good thing for the neoliberals here in this country in order to put the country between two impossible choices, white supremacy or, on the other hand, ultraliberalism, where corporate money decides on the outcomes of French policies. And that's why we are definitely not facing choices of reasons. The only candidates that actually had socioeconomic policies in favor of the masses and the working class were disqualified from the first round. Well, for the Socialist Party, which pretends to be on the left, a bit like the Democrats in the US, for once they had a candidate named Benoît Hamon who came forward with a left-wing program, a progressive program, stood against racism for the rights of the Palestinians. And what happened, even though he won the left-wing primaries, he was literally boycotted by his own party, and the whole leadership of the Socialist Party joined his opponent, Emmanuel Macron. A boycott just like Bernie Sanders in the US or Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. So right now, French people are asked to choose between Marine Le Pen, who is an openly racist candidate, who does not believe in equality between citizens, who is pushing forward for actually the supremacy of whites and Christians in France, and on the other hand, a person who comes to you as this young, former investment banker who tries to appeal to minorities by telling them, hey, buddy, racism is evil, but at the same time promises them to implement a neoliberal agenda that will actually fuel and ignite and spark even more hatred between citizens by putting them into more competition. Hence, the two evils, Hitler on the one hand, because Marine Le Pen is a direct heir of the far right in France, and Emmanuel Macron, who only wants to have a country of startup companies and, of course, who wants to run France as if it were a company.
Right, and add to that neoliberal component, you're talking about Barack Obama, former president of the United States, released a video of his own urging people to vote for Emmanuel Macron. This is what he had to say.
I have admired the campaign that Emmanuel Macron has run. He has stood up for liberal values. He put forward a vision for the important role that France plays in Europe and around the world. And he is committed to a better future for the French people. He appeals to people's hopes and not their fears. And I enjoyed speaking to Emmanuel recently to hear about his independent movement and his vision for the future of France.
So yes, despite you encouraging people to choose Macron over Le Pen, you have quite a different take on the matter than, say, Barack Obama. Specify for us this distinction you've made between choosing Macron, I guess more specifically. I mean, he's a neoliberal candidate. It is the choice of the lesser evil, but at the same time, you have a lot of apprehensions about supporting him.
Well, actually, Emmanuel Macron is no good news either. The only difference between him and Marine Le Pen is that Marine Le Pen is immediate fire. She will ignite a racial war in France. Emmanuel Macron is actually a social war and clash of classes in favor of the big banks and the big business owners. So the immediate urgency is to keep Marine Le Pen from accessing to power. That's for one thing. It does not mean racist and identity politics will disappear, because during the first round, the three openly racist candidates, Marine Le Pen, François Fillon, and Dupont-Aignan, collectively got 46% of the votes during the first round. So our only concern right now is blocking her from becoming president. But the very next step is actually to make the country ungovernable for Emmanuel Macron by acting on two fronts. We have the upcoming parliamentary elections in June, which means pushing people to register as independent candidates. Just register, become a candidate. We'll see later about the logistics. And of course, mobilizing from the grassroots up in order to make the social movement more coordinated and much more efficient than when it was last spring, when it rose against the labor reform. It's only a question of priorities. I'm against both candidates because they are disastrous for the country.
Right. And you further argue that governments of the past, including the Socialist Party, have already been implementing far-right anti-Muslim policies for years and have created an apparatus of a fascist state in France. Most people here think of a socialist party as a leftist party, but in France, that's not the case. But more than that, can you explain what you mean by previous governments having had fascist policies already?
If you look back in the 1980s, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father, was actually a very marginal. He was on the extreme right with 1 or 2% during the elections. But it turned out during the 80s and 90s, many people from the mainstream left-wing and right-wing parties actually agreed with him. As a matter of fact, we even had a left-wing socialist prime minister saying that Jean-Marie Le Pen is raising the right questions on immigration. And then, of course, you see the laws being implemented both from the right and the left mainstream parties, the exclusion of Muslim girls from public schools when they wear a headscarf, the constant singling out and demonizing of Muslims by the last administration with a left-wing government under François Hollande and Manuel Valls. When you have a prime minister speaking of Islamofascism and who pretends to be a left-wing minister, when you have the Minister of Women's Rights, Laurence Rossignol, comparing, quote, Muslim women who wear the headscarf were comparable to American Negroes who were in favor of slavery, and the list goes on. So the left itself is sold out to the far right, because the only difference between the two is that the far right uses openly blatant racist vocabulary, whereas the left and mainstream right-wing party, maybe less at the right, use what we call dog whistle. They use specific keywords, but actually express the same hatred. Another problem happened in the early 2000s with Nicolas Sarkozy. When he came to power, he stole all the ideas from the far right and put them under what he called the unapologetic right. It's a bit like your Republican Party today, endorsing racist ideas by calling that freedom of speech or protecting culture, etc. So the rise of Marine Le Pen and her appearance today at the second round of the election is only a confirmation that there is what we call the Le Penization of the minds, meaning that racist ideas are not a far-right monopoly, but actually shared by the whole political spectrum in France.
Yes, give us a sense of who won the debate the other night, and I understand that Macron was declared the winner by several media outlets. What were your thoughts?
It depends what you call a winner. When you have two lousy candidates, one of them speaks a bit better French and understands and remains a bit more polite on the set, yes, you can call him a winner. But according to the French mainstream media, that was the worst presidential debate ever in French history. Marine Le Pen was highly aggressive and throwing fake news on the one hand and trying to provoke Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron, on the other, showed a lot more control over his program when it came to economic policies, but to him the rationale was that what's best for big corporations is good for France. That's not what we want. We have 3.5 million people who don't even have decent housing. We have the cost of discrimination in France is over 150 billion euros a year, and we have a highly fragmented society. So, actually, I had to give up. It was such an annoying debate, but I had to watch it because I could report to other reporters. But we haven't seen any clear ideological win on either side. We just saw the far right just acting like she tried to copy or to emulate Donald Trump by being highly aggressive and provoking the other candidate. And actually, nobody is a winner. Maybe Emmanuel Macron maintained a sense of, of control. But what's going to happen for the next 5 years? The only indication is that the next administration will not work on behalf of the working class or the masses. They will work on behalf of big banks, and then locking the working class in what I call the digital proletarian by selling their labors to big corporations online and calling it a day.
All right, Yasser, we'll be watching closely on Sunday. I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network. News Network. News Network. News Network. News Network. News Network. News Network.